The period of time following the Dragon Quest Heroes reveal for Smash Bros. Was an interesting experience for me. Dragon Quest, a series that never really hit the Western mainstream, was suddenly in the minds of the gaming public for a while, and it was then that I began my discovery of these games. And one of the first pieces of Dragon Quest information I remember hearing was that regardless of whether the Western world realizes it or not, Dragon Quest III is a very important game. I certainly had my fun with the first two Dragon Quest games, but there's no doubt that they're very much formative games. Dragon Quest I laid down the bare-bones framework of a video game RPG, and while Dragon Quest II greatly improved and expanded on it, it is still a game that is very simple and in many ways flawed. You need a certain amount of patience and tolerance for archaic game design to get much out of these. They're classics, but definitely products of their time. But in my opinion, and many others as well, Dragon Quest III marks a turning point. A crossing of a threshold between somewhat tedious RPG history lesson and a game of genuine and lasting quality. So get ready to take up the sword and set out into the unknown. It's time to live the legend. As the curtain rises on the trilogy's end, okay, hold up. There's a necessary detour we need to take first, that being a discussion of the different versions of this game. Dragon Quest III was originally launched on the Famicom in 1988, and on the NES in 1992. However, the game was remade for the Super Famicom in 1996. And with that, we reach the saddening topic of Dragon Quest games that never left Japan. We never officially got this version over here. This is a fan translation, but we did get a mobile version which is based on it. And for the most part, it does its job quite well. Most of the 16-bit artwork is still intact, and it's undoubtedly the nicest looking out of the 3 mobile remakes. But the reason I'm bringing this up now is that the mobile version of the third entry unfortunately has some notable compromises compared to its console counterpart, such as the game's opening. The story begins with the tale of Ortega, the main character's father, a great hero who, responding to the encroaching threat of the dreaded archfiend Baramos, sets out to slay the tyrant and bring peace to all the realm. A noble quest that doesn't end well for the man. Originally, Ortega's ill-fated quest was spoken of often but never actually shown. In the console remake, however, we got an extended opening that details Ortega's departure, his adventuring, his battles, and ultimately his tragic failure. And the mobile version completely erases this entire new sequence. You see, your goal in this game as Ortega's child is to finish what your father started and slay Baramos in his place. Actually seeing your dad fail in his quest really drives up the stakes of your adventure and the threat of the evil that Ortega succumbed to. So cutting it completely isn't doing the mobile version any favors. Sadly, it's not the only downside. The original remake had detailed battle animations for the monsters you fought, but here? Nothing. There are a few other cuts too, like the removal of certain environmental effects. This still isn't a bad version of the game. It's accessible and well priced, and it's nice that we finally got the 16-bit version in some official capacity, but the cuts still kind of hurt, and it's a pity that the Switch version didn't rectify any of these shortcomings. Alright, detour over, let's start this adventure. The first thing you see is this dreamlike sequence where you're given a personality test? A really well done and intricate one at that. Can't say I saw this coming, but it actually makes a lot of sense. The whole point of these blank slate silent protagonists in Dragon Quest is to be an avatar, something the player projects themselves onto. And that works a lot better when the game tries as hard as it does to get to know you, and is also the first game in the series to give you a choice of gender. Definitely a unique and effective way of starting things off. As I said before, your goal is to find and slay the archfiend Baramos. And after the King of Aliahan briefs you on your mission, it's time to get yourself some traveling companions from a local adventuring guild. This is where one of Dragon Quest III's key additions comes to a head. Character classes. You're given a selection of different classes to choose from for your 3 traveling buddies. There aren't a huge number of them, but enough to add some variety with all the different things that the classes excel at. Martial artists hit hard and fast, mages and clerics do attack and healing magic, so on and so forth. Your choice of class also dictates what weapons a character can use, which is pretty important since there are new weapon types this time, most notably the whips and boomerangs, that can hit multiple targets, albeit with less power. A nice addition considering that used to be a mage's only talent. And to add to this newfound customization, once someone hits level 20, it's possible to reclass them into something else. Their stats are cut in half and they're sent back to level 1, but they keep any spells they learn. So you could end up with a warrior that knows some healing magic, or an offensive spellcaster that can take bigger hits. You can't reclass the main character, but hero is a fantastic class that you wouldn't want to change anyway. Unfortunately, the system isn't as fleshed out as in later games. Aside from the sages, which are hard to get, there aren't any actual promotions. So you're just mixing and matching class traits, not actually bolstering them into something new and improved like you can in later games. Honestly, I barely touched class changes, and I made it to the end alright. Though I did have a pretty hard time in the late game, so I might have just played it wrong. There's a notable downside to this build-it-yourself style of team building, though. Everyone you play as is devoid of character and personality. Granted, you didn't have much of that in the last game, but now you don't have any. Your companions are there for battling and nothing else. Fortunately, this cloud has a bright and glistening silver lining. The playable characters might not be very interesting, but the world around them is. I'd be here way too long if I tried to describe every improvement Dragon Quest III has over its predecessors, so suffice to say that it's basically the realization of the ideas laid out before, with a hefty dose of spit and polish. Nearly every aspect is just better done this time. Dragon Quests 1 and 2 figured out how to make things work, but the third one figured out how to make them fun. Of particular note is the world you're trekking through. In the first 2 games, not a lot of locations were particularly memorable, but now they definitely pop a lot more. Different towns have different accents and dialects, in the mobile version anyway, which really helps to sell the feeling of a worldwide trek. Honestly, the dialogue and tone in general are a lot more colorful in this game. The last 2 adventures were pretty no-nonsense overall, but this one is notably more relaxed, considering that most of the world doesn't even know about Baramos yet. This allows the different villages to have their own little mini-adventures that don't just revolve around you trying to off the big bad before he annihilates the world. There's stuff like the King of Romilly trying to coronate you king of his realm so he can ignore his duties and go gambling, or a Japanese-inspired town that speaks entirely in haiku. The world's just a lot more alive this time, and there's a lot more to take in as you gather colorful magic orbs so you can wake up a mystical bird who can fly you to Baramos' lair for your final showdown. And wow, 3 for 3. This game's overworld theme, simply titled Adventure, is fantastic as well, easily one of the most iconic tracks in the whole series. As far as negatives for this game go, I do still have a few. For one, there's fleeing from enemies. In most later RPGs, if you're appreciably stronger than your opponent, and there's not much to be gained from battling them, running away is made easier to save time. But not here, apparently. I had a hard time getting away from slimes near the end of the game, so it's obvious that your chances of fleeing stay the same no matter what you're fighting, which can really bog things down. There's this holy protection spell that's supposed to keep weaker monsters away, but it barely seems to make any difference. Then there's offensive magic spells. They often just whiff and do no damage at all. I get that enemies have a built-in chance of resisting particular spells, but I wish that resisted attack spells just did less damage rather than doing absolutely nothing. I usually found them to be a less reliable method of attacking than physical strikes, and that's doubly disappointing considering that your arsenal of offensive spellcraft is much broader and more interesting this time. Come to think of it, the second game had these problems too, but when they're still here in a much better game, they stick out more. But despite these flaws, Dragon Quest III really does live up to its reputation. With the world traversed from corner to corner, I confronted Baramos, engaged in mortal combat, and finally finished what Ortega started. And with the evil destroyed and a triumphant homecoming, it was now time for Dragon Quest to break its own rules. According to everything that the Dragon Quest series had taught you up to this point, this should have been the end of the game. And frankly, even if it was, Dragon Quest III would probably have still been hailed as a masterpiece. But it wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Right during your moment of triumph, an unseen force shakes the earth, casually slaughters the royal guard, and reveals itself as ZOMA, the true master of the underworld. You know Baramos? That guy you thought was the main villain? That was this guy's lackey. Sure, for an RPG these days, the first villain you see getting one-upped by a much bigger and scarier one later on isn't much of a surprise. But back then, this was an unprecedented twist. A massive gash opens in the earth, so naturally, you do the only logical thing and jump right into it. But you don't find yourself in some cave. You're in a whole new world. The darkened underworld called Alefgard. This is where, gradually, you realize something incredible. You've been playing as Erdrick this whole time. Yes, Erdrick, that legendary figure that the first two games wouldn't shut up about. Dragon Quest's heroic paragon. The progenitor of all the great heroes to come later. I feel sorry for this plot twist. It's simultaneously brilliant and about as well kept a secret as Sheik's true identity. See, here's the issue. As things stand now, Erdrick is easily Dragon Quest's most iconic hero. He's got a trilogy named after him, and just about anyone who knows anything about Dragon Quest calls him by this name. However, nobody calls him that throughout this adventure, not even after you fall into Alefgard. As it turns out, Erdrick is a title given to only the greatest of heroes, and the main character doesn't get that title until the very end of the game. His true identity was meant to be a surprise, but it's a surprise that's about 3 decades old now, and since his secret name is now his most famous one, the third game's surprise status as the trilogy's prequel was basically thrown out the window. I already spoiled it earlier by showing you what Erdrick looks like, and there's a reason why I didn't even bother to keep it hidden. It's barely a secret anymore. And that's a pity. When this was new, the hero's identity must have come as a gradual realization to the player, as they traveled through the Alefgard of the past and started doing the things that would be etched in legend. You retrieve the Ball of Light that would become the core of the conflict in Dragon Quest I, free a goddess who would play a small but crucial role in the defeat of Hargan, and finally face down the true evil plaguing the darkened Alefgard. And man, the fight against ZOMA was intense. Easily my favorite final battle in the trilogy. Not sure if it was the build-up to the battle, the stiff challenge that ZOMA presents, or the awesome music, but winning this fight really makes you feel like a legend in motion. As his death draws near, ZOMA warns that new evils will take his place, long after the hero is dead and buried. But joke's on him! I know how that's gonna end. In his last moments, ZOMA shuts the way between the underworld and the world above. But hope endures as light finally dawns in Alefgard, transforming it into a world in its own standing. As the hero returns triumphantly, he is christened Erdrick as the world rejoices and his name goes down in legend. But not you three. History forgets all your labors. The third time is unquestionably the charm when it comes to Dragon Quest. Bear in mind, it's still a very old game, and it does show in places. It's still a lot simpler than the later entries in the series, the way forward is a little obtuse at points, and there's definitely a grind involved. But as far as 80s RPGs go, This one holds up remarkably well, and is definitely the point when Dragon Quest really started hitting its stride with excellent games to follow. Will I review any more of them? Maybe. I think 4 Dragon Quest videos in a row is probably enough at present. For now, I have learned 3 important things from this trilogy. RPGs owe this series a life debt, Dragon Quest has amazingly few dragons in it, and recording these games takes up an ungodly amount of storage space.